how much of the purgings or similar were preemptive, as in before any Trotskyists actually made any threat against the government, before any of these people actually were shown to be loyal to Trotsky?
Yeah, I mean, actually, quite a few. The collectivization was a direct result to kulaks withholding food. So that one, now, any given individual kulak, this is what's difficult of class analysis, right? The kulaks as a class were withholding food. But how does one pinpoint any given individual person as the one withholding food? All you know is you have a class of rich peasants, and you have less food in the market than you should have. Now, right, finding the individual person who is withholding it is incredibly difficult, which is why they had to send people out to each given farm. But in this case, right, that was not exactly preemptive. Does this make sense?
Right.
It was an internal threat, but it wasn't an individual threat that this particular kulak is doing it and that particular kulak is doing it. And this is why, for example, and this actually led to excesses, why they asked poorer peasants to report on the rich peasants, right? I believe they were called the mazukas, who were the regular peasants, to report the kulaks. Because the Bolsheviks actually had a great deal of modesty in this regard. They didn't believe that bureaucrats, and I don't mean that in a pejorative sense, I mean people who work in the state apparatus, or officers, or army officials will know the circumstances of a given area, which is why they relied on, right, lesser farmers. Only problem with that is if they have an axe to grind, if they have a grudge. But of course, right, the answer is, what's the other alternative? If you have a class that's threatening to starve your country, in which way can you identify the individuals? Except by, again, the exigencies of trusting the people. Does that answer?
Yes.
As for the Trotskyists, Trotskyist literature was being brought into the Soviet Union from his exile. As soon as he was exiled, he was writing circulars, degrading Stalin, denigrating the Central Committee, calling it a Thermidorian reaction, calling it a failed work or a corrupted, no, degenerate worker state. To give Trotsky this credit, but this is a very superficial credit to give him. He called for the defense of the Soviet Union against Nazism. But if you denigrate every single aspect of the Soviet Union all the way up to the invasion, and then say, oh yeah, but you should really defend this, right? You could probably see how that's not a particularly good defense of one's actions. Does that answer?
Yes.
Yeah.
Yeah, I'm thinking of a comment Zizek makes in regards to the French Revolution, which is, looking back on it, some people say, oh, well, it could have been different, something, whatever. He's like, no, it absolutely could not be different. We had to go through this zero level of Jacobinism and all the French terror and whatnot in order to establish the Republic. And I guess given the fact that you wrote a paper recently kind of arguing if you don't have Maoism, you get Stalinism, or Marxist-Leninism practiced very rigorously through war communism instituted. So given the fact that you're also a Maoist, what do you see that could have been maybe possibly done different, or do you think what's done was done and carried out to a T?
Obviously, there's two things, right? What's done is done, right? And we need to recognize this, and rigorously what we need to do is examine this history of what really did happen. And this is why I said, if you want to know what really happened, you need to get into the text. And it's not going to be perfect, but this notion of history and the knowledge of history is something valuable worth pursuing. But along a different tack, every history also offers an alternative history, right? Every history, through its actualization, offers critical junctures whereby perhaps things could have been different. Not in this sort of alternate history that, oh, we could be living someplace different. But the lessons of that history are sometimes the lessons of its failure. For example, the collapse of the Soviet Union doesn't teach us, oh, well, if only I could go back to 1940 and change this or that policy. What it teaches us is these particular institutions of the Soviet Union, an over-reliance on, for example, the state apparatus rather than mass movements, the reliance on legal procedures rather than informal democratic procedures. Plenty of people died under the Cultural Revolution, but there's also another interesting feature. Plenty of people committed suicide under the Cultural Revolution because they felt so ashamed for being, right, being accused of being a capitalist, being accused of being, a bureaucrat. And in fact, Lenin writes about this while he's dying at the end of his life. He says, we can perhaps adopt new methods free of the normal strictures of the state, measures perhaps with humor or unique and creative. For example, I think one of the examples he gives is finding a bureaucrat who's abusing his post, right, and leaving him a letter saying, oh, by the way, how are these accounts going? And yes, we know how these accounts are going. Almost like a joke, right? So that he realizes, yes, he's under scrutiny. Yes, we know what he's doing, but not necessarily carrying out the strictures of, legal, rigorous enforcement of, for example, corruption, which might lead to time in the gulag or an execution. So in this case, the spontaneity, the mass movement of Mao, especially exemplified by the Cultural Revolution, the early and middle parts of the Cultural Revolution, I think are a check on what people constitute Stalinism or, state Marxist-Leninism. Does that answer?
In a sense. I mean, more specifically, I guess, you have to make a distinction, some of the things Stalin did were justified, and then they're excessive, and therefore just, why did he do this? Like Doctor's Plot, for example.
Okay.
So,
yeah. Well, and I think Mao sums it up nicely, which was Stalin was 70% good, 30% bad. And of course, the real danger of history is figuring out which was the 70 and which was the 30. Near the end of Stalin's life, there was something called the Doctor's Plot, and basically he set up a long, rigorous, or elaborate setup to basically accuse Jewish intellectuals and specifically doctors of attempting to poison the Soviet leadership. And so, of course, the usual refrain is this is anti-Semitism at its worst, Stalin, the backwards Georgian, again, because he wasn't Russian, he was an ethnic minority. Actually, let me contextualize that. Stalin's father was a freed serf and a cobbler, and he was an ethnic minority. For comparison, this would be, and he was the immediate successor of Lenin. This would be if, after the Civil War, a black from Mexico became the president of the United States. So keep that in mind, that Stalin himself, as a leader, obviously this will be misinterpreted, but that's a very Barack Obama moment, that the son of a cobbler, is a leader. But of course, what they basically, the accusation is, well, he's just an uneducated Georgian, here's just his prejudice coming out, and he's going crazy. But it's also worth noting Stalin and the Soviet Union supported Israel. And they actually supported Israel as a positive good. They thought that the influx of the Jews into Israel would actually be beneficial for the Soviet Union, because keep in mind, who owns the Middle East right now? The British. And the British are active and hostily opposed to the Soviet Union. So, many of these Jews are coming from the Soviet Union or were freed by the Soviets, and they see this as, hey, this is going to support us, and this is going to be a positive motion. Jews in Europe had a history of radicalism, Marx was ethnically Jewish, and so they thought, hey, this state of Israel could be something very, very positive for the world and for the Middle East, as opposed to the British imperialism. Very quickly, Israel becomes a client state of the United States, and in turn of Europe, Western Europe, that is. And so, again, the Doctor's Plot, which basically was a spur to anti-Semitism, or would function as a spur to anti-Semitism, itself was, I think, unjustified. So let me be clear, but also understandable given the context of Israel, its position relative to the Soviet Union, and the dangers it posed to socialist movements in the region. But again, historical exigencies, in this case, I think the Doctor's Plot is definitely part of that 30% bad. There's no justification for characterizing, the code word was cosmopolitanism, and Jewish people as somehow an internal threat because of political ends. I think that goes too far.